In this video we will talk about the move 4 knight c3 in the advanced variation. This video will be a two-parter. In the first video we will talk about 7 bishop e3. In the second video we will talk about 7 h4. After 4 knight c3 the arising positions will be very sharp, they will be very complicated, they will be very messy, and you need to do your homework so as to avoid a quick defeat. I have analyzed the positions very deeply with very strong engines, and sometimes it is difficult to explain the moves because some moves are forced, some moves are simply the best, and some moves I will just say that they are the best without explaining them too deeply, because the positions and the variations are very complex. We start with the move 4 knight c3. The point is that after e6, white plays g4. Bishop g6, knight ge2, c5, and in this first video of the two-parter we will have a look at bishop e3. Bishop e3 is not as sharp as 7h4, but it is still very messy. Knight c6. Here white has already three options: f4, queen d2 and d takes c. f4 is not really good. Black plays h5, f5, ef, g5. White is arguing that the bishop is completely cut off on g6 and that the grip on the f4 square promises enough compensation for the sacrificed pawn. In practice, however, this does not quite work out and black is more than fine. We take on d4. If white takes with a knight, there is bishop b4, bishop b5, knight e7, castle, castle, knight f3, and here black could already win the game with f4. This is obviously not a forced variation, but this is something that could happen. Bishop takes, queen b6, king h1, we take on c3, white must take on c6, we take on b2, rook b1, we take on a2, bishop b7, and we win the game with bishop takes c2. If white takes on d4 with a bishop, black has two moves, bishop b4 or queen takes g5. Queen takes g5 is somewhat risky, so I do not recommend this. Bishop b4 is completely fine. After a3, we take on c3, we take on g5, h4, queen g4, queen d2, and now very strong d4. After bishop takes, knight ge7, long castle, black plays rook d8, and the pin along the d-file already gives black the upper hand. 8 queen d2 is answered by h5. g4 is a weakness and black attacks it right away. Knight f4, c takes d, bishop takes d4, and now we can take the pawn on c2, because the bishop on d4 is hanging. White has two moves, bishop b5 or rook c1. After rook c1, black plays bishop e4, knight takes, pawn takes. The pawn structure is very good for black because black has now the d5 square. The idea is knight e7 and knight to d5. White plays bishop b5, knight e7, knight takes h5, a6, and this position is better for black because the bishop on d4 has to protect the pawn on e5, the bishop on d4 is hanging, the knight on h5 is also a bit misplaced, and black has a healthy structure. If white plays bishop b5 instead of rook c1, we retreat the bishop to h7, knight takes h5, knight ge7, rook c1, a6, bishop a4, and here we need to be a bit precise. The ambitious move b5 is a bit too early and can lead to problems. After the piece sacrifice, knight takes b5, a takes b, bishop takes b5, queen c7, and this is not so clear. White has very good compensation for the piece, and this cannot be recommended. Instead, we need to be a bit precise here and play the very strong move rook b8. We are simply preparing b5, and there's nothing white can do about it. Knight e2, b5, bishop c2, and once again we don't even take on e4, we play bishop e4 just to get control over the d5 square. Takes, rook d1, rook c8, queen e3, we give a check, king f1, we take a pawn, white takes also, and queen d5. And after queen takes, knight takes, black is already better because we have a very nice knight on d5. The white knight on h5 is misplaced. White has a worse bishop, a worse pawn structure, and can fight for a draw. What's left is the main move, d takes c5. After d takes c5, once again we attack the weak pawn on g4, h5. The idea of h5 is to get control over the f5 square. Once the g4 pawn is not there anymore, black will have a very nice square on f5, where he will probably put a knight. In this position, white has two moves. He can go either knight d4 or knight f4. Knight d4 is less critical than knight f4 and leads to a very easy and simple position for black after a6. White has two moves, either g5 or knight takes g6. After knight takes c6, b takes, knight a4, we take on g4, knight b6, rook b8, queen g4, and we cash in a pawn on c2. It is not entirely clear as yet, but it is safe to say that black is slightly better. If white goes g5, then we have full control over f5. We play knight ge7, knight a4, we take on e5, knight b6, and this leads to a very chaotic position at the end of which black is winning. Bishop e4, f3, knight f5, knight takes f5, knight takes f3 check, king e2, bishop f5, c4, bishop e7, queen a4 check, king f8, and here white has two moves. If he takes on a8, we play d4, very strong, and black is winning. If he takes on d5 instead, we take on g5, knight takes a8, and bishop g4 is once again very good for black. More critical is knight f4, and here we play d4. White takes on g6, of course, f takes g, but there are two pieces forked and white needs to find a solution. There are two moves, queen d3 and bishop d3. After bishop d3, black is already better. After knight g to e7, knight b5, we take a piece on e3, knight d6, check, king d7. And spoiler alert, in the second part of the two-parter we will see many positions where black plays king d7, and the king is very safe on d7 actually. So we do not need to be afraid to put our king on d7 in this specific variation. It is in most cases just fine. Here white has two moves, knight takes b7 or castle. If knight takes b7, queen b8, bishop a6, knight d5, c4, ef check, king takes f2, queen e5, cd5 and ed5 is already much better for black, because white's king is worse than black's. If white castles on move 14, then there is knight d5, knight f7, e takes f2, king h1, queen h4, already with winning advantage for black. For example, knight takes h8 is met by knight takes e5, g4 is hanging, and it is a horrible position for white. What's left is the main move 11, queen d3, and this move leads to a forced draw. After king f7, knight e4, we take on e3, white takes back, knight ge7, white gives a check, king g8, knight takes e6, queen d5. This is a very forced sequence of moves. Knight c7, queen takes h1, a long castle, knight a5. This is an important move. It is imperative to stop bishop c4 from landing on the board. White has two moves, knight f4, queen f4 or knight takes a8. Knight takes a8 actually gives black some advantage after h takes g4, queen c3, queen f3, very strong move, queen takes a5, rook takes h2, bishop c4, king h7, and black is better. So white needs to go queen f4. The idea is to give a check on c4, and black needs to be a bit precise here. g5 would lose on account of bishop c4 check, king h7 and queen f7 very strong, and black is lost. Instead there is a very nice move, queen c6. We retreat our queen, and after bishop c4 there are many ways that secure a draw. I analyzed knight takes c4, king h7 is also leading to a forced draw, but let's have a look at knight takes c4, queen takes, king h7, knight e6, and here are many moves, h4, king h6, knight d5, they are all drawn. I chose knight d5, and there is no way to avoid the perpetual check. So this variation can end in a forced draw after a very sharp tactical skirmish, and I think that this variation is very interesting and also very much fun to play with black, because the positions are so sharp, they are non-standard, and you can play for a win very well. Obviously you can also lose very quickly, but if you do your homework